together again. Fast snack. Our next panel, we did a forum on this or a similar one. Jason was not on it, but Tim Kobie was. Forces Undermining and Preserving Neighborhoods. These are the LLCs. This had a terrific response. I mean, we had more people interested in this than any other topic that we did. It is the single greatest underminer of neighborhoods, I think, that we have. And I was surprised when we presented this the first time, what percentage of Cleveland neighborhoods are LLCs. And anybody who's worked on this issue and getting your arms around it is very, very difficult. So I'll turn it over to Councilman Brancatelli, and he will introduce the panel. And be sure to put your questions in the chat or save them up for later. Go ahead, Tony.
Thank you very much, and certainly thank you for putting this panel together. I know there's a pretty deep topic today, but right now, as the description says, our home sale prices are up all over the region, but the recovery of our neighborhoods after the housing crisis has been uneven and divided along racial lines. Opportunistic investors and speculators took advantage of low sale prices to add to their portfolios, and now business interests own a significant portion of our residential real estate market, especially in certain areas. This panel is going to provide data on the rising trend of business owners of 1 to 3 family homes and how that can affect neighborhoods, and the way data is being used to target strategic approaches for neighborhood recovery. The first speaker that's going to go over a topic is Jason Powers, the director of the Middle Neighborhoods Initiative for the city of Cleveland, where he served since April of 2019. The initiative was co-developed by the Cleveland Foundation as part of a city-led partnership to provide long-term strategic support within municipal government. And prior to his work with the city of Cleveland, Powers was the director of marketing development at the Old Brooklyn Community Development Corporation. There he worked with his development team on projects to support their middle income community, focusing on place-based marketing, data-driven pilot programs, and a public health lens to community development. Before we turned into Cleveland, he worked at Neighborhood Works in Washington, D.C., and as National Public Affairs and Communications Manager, supporting a network of 250 community development corporations. His work took him around the country to support partner organizations in their communication strategy and neighboring positioning efforts. Early in his career, Powers served as a legislative advisor to Congressman John Oliver, the chairman of the Appropriations Subcommittee on HUD and Department of Transportation. He holds a degree from from Indiana University and the University of London, and he was voted most likely to have a child born addicted to Starbucks coffee. Tim Kobie will be the second speaker. Tim is currently business process analyst with the City of Cleveland's Department of Building and Housing, and working with a wide range of data sources to inform on issues such as demolition, code enforcement, permitting, and housing market health. He is co-chair of the Investor Working Group for the Vacant and Abandoned Property Action Council, and is participant on the Age-Friendly Cleveland Advisory Council. Tim became interested in neighborhood development during his 2 AmeriCorps service terms while attending Case Western Reserve University, and after graduating from Case, he attended Cleveland State University, where he received a master's in urban planning, design and development, and a PhD in urban studies and public affairs with a focus on housing and neighborhood development. Tim has worked as a private consultant, has served as an expert witness in mortgage fraud case, and conducted research for DC nonprofit on food access issues, retail development, and census challenges. Prior to joining the City of Cleveland full-time, Tim was a Strong Cities, Strong Communities Fellow embedded with the Department of Building and Housing, working on demolition prioritization, CDC code partnership, and bulk holder task force. And he was voted most likely to talk about Bitcoin during a cocktail party. So we have 2 well-rounded speakers today. Jason's going to kick it off and talk about the Cleveland Middle Neighborhoods and the initiatives that they're working on and how that's a strategy for us. Jason, it's all yours.
Thank you, Councilman. Thank you for that introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm excited about this panel as much as many of you are, because of the research that Tim has brought forward on middle neighborhoods and how much it's affected my own work. So the way this is going to work is that we'll talk about why middle neighborhoods in particular are going to be a focus of some of the conversations around the business buyers that are coming in, specifically because of the way we framed this session, right? Undermining and preserving our neighborhoods. Well, middle neighborhoods are situated, and the definition is broad, and we'll get into this, but they're situated in a place where being preserved or undermined is really the crisis of the moment. If you think of our neighborhoods, you think of the challenges of those that have grown and are seeing major investments those that have fallen over generations at this point and achieved a significant distress. When you think of the number one or number two challenges, you don't think of preserving housing or dealing with undermining qualities necessarily when you're in those far extremes. But in this middle tipping kind of range is really where we think we have the best chance of success, but also where we have perhaps the most urgent need in terms of timelines. And so the Middle Neighborhoods program is really a data-driven exploration of a big city like Cleveland, but it is useful in many of our smaller suburban counterparts that I work with to identifying place within cities. So we'll start with this and we'll bring the business component in as an issue. So a very brief primer on middle neighborhoods. This definition is the one I often bring to the conversation because so often the initial thought is that these are something akin to middle class, middle income, that we can really just justify it with one sort of data point. But the reality is a middle community, a place that's in the middle, is a changing target over time. In the 1990s, they would have looked very different in Cleveland or in Baltimore or in St. Louis than in 2020s. But one thing that is really key is that we believe that improvement strategies remain realistic. And I know pragmatism and realism are seldom the things we talk about in our campaigns to lead cities, but in reality, when it comes time to do the work, we need to recognize the resources that we have and where can we do the work to create stability and really support our communities. And so from that lens, we started looking around at the communities of Cleveland, and we have partners throughout the United States in the Middle Neighborhoods cohort that have done similar work. So this is not just groundbreaking in our Northeast Ohio version. And the way I often frame it and like to talk about it is gaps. And so when you think of gaps in valuations, which are causing the opportunity for these large scale equity investors to come in and purchase up properties and to move our markets without our actual, without the best intentions necessarily of the communities, gaps are responsible for a lot of that. It's an asymmetry, if you will, from a market standpoint of reality versus the perceptions. So it starts with gaps in perceptions. This can be crime. This can be quality of life. These can be things that are really sort of the baseline assumptions you make about a place's quality. And as a result, though, we have something quantifiable, home values, that change because of these perception gaps. It does work the other way, of course, right? Perceived quality of a neighborhood can be something that runs ahead of values as well. What happens is we also have a gap in community engagement. Now, this is really important when we talk about business buyers, specifically because while renters versus homeowners is not a dialogue that we like to participate in, any resident of a community, whether it's someone renting, purchasing their first home, or a long-term home buyer at a higher price point, all represent members of the community. But the challenge is that we do know that tenure in communities changes quite significantly between purchasers and renters. The latest numbers I've seen in Cleveland are around 12.7 years for the average homeowner, 2.3 for the average renter in terms of the place that they're currently within. So that's a 6 times longevity. And that longevity is related deeply to how well you know your neighbors, how much you engage with your local nonprofits and civic centers. And so as community engagement starts to relinquish, you end up losing that generational civic pride. So this is place pride, this is value add. A community that has that brand in place tends to have the ability to preserve its value longer, which is something we've seen in middle neighborhoods. And so just keeping this in mind, how middle neighborhoods relate to this, the longer a neighborhood has that preserved value of civic pride, of place that residents can glom onto and connect with, the more that element remains part of the value proposition for living somewhere. And this is all going to come down to, can we preserve home ownership? Can we preserve local ownership when we're competing against incredibly capable, fast, and well-funded buyers? And then the most important one, we just had Kevin Nowak talking a lot about ARPA dollars. I know he wasn't putting them down because they are quite an incredible opportunity. But if public investment isn't there, or if it isn't used in ways that can really leverage the private sector, then the private investment does disappear. And while obviously business buyers are a form of private investment, we have a different definition of success in that respect. So within the idea of middle markets is this conversation of a quality, stable middle market is what we're aiming for, what we want to achieve. The weaker or declining middle markets are what we tend to see in areas where we're seeing this onslaught occur. And so the definitions of on the ground, what they look like, are something like what you see here. And it's the makeup of the market. And so when you have higher values, when you have sustained values that continue to stay within the market's parameters of appreciation, but not run away with value appreciation, you have home buyers, typically in that middle class, framing of value, framed in the form of people buying the homes that they can afford. Within a market. People do tend to stretch their budgets to a place of purchase, the home being one of the most significant purchases anyone will ever make in their lifetime. And so as a result of that, you do tend to see that in the more stable, stronger markets, you're going to end up with more middle-class income individuals buying. You also do have investor activity, and we're seeing this as a leading indication where you tend to see some decline. However, there are, of course, investor buyers that are quality, that have quality homes under their portfolio, that want to be a part of community support. It's not a carte blanche bad industry, but we do see different players in different places. So that's where we look at the weak middle markets, right? We have most of our development going on through public subsidy or nonprofit developers. There really is not a lot of activity on the private side in terms of investment properties, investing in properties for sale. And then we also have neighborhood filtering challenges, right? And so in these communities that are traditionally middle, 1970s, 80s, 90s, some of the best places you could live in the entire city of Cleveland and many of our legacy cities across the Rust Belt. However, over the decades and generations, these neighborhoods, as they've declined, have become more affordable, and I'll talk about the natural occurrence of affordability in these places. However, with affordability and weaker incomes comes less of a long-term investment opportunity. And so these things compound, right? This is the challenge we have, that we are seeing a lot of undermining forces, and they all tend to rely on one metric, which is home value. So all these things plug into what creates a value of a proposition of a neighborhood. As that declines, there are seemingly endless undermining forces that come into play. So one thing that I wanted to touch on specifically is the idea of the relationship between incomes and home values. So this chart is showing something that occurs where if you look at your home prices in your census tracts of your specific areas, and you look at incomes, and I encourage you to look for income data from your municipalities, from your partners, to see if you can get even more clear data. But you can look at these two and create a ratio. And what ends up happening is that if the home values are disjointed from the incomes by a significant margin, then we're seeing some kind of pressure one way or the other. And so if you look here, what you can see is that the city percent of metro in terms of income to home value, you can see that median home incomes in the city of Cleveland are at about 50% that of our metro region. Yet the home values are at about 1/3 that of our metro region. And so while there's obviously a lot of forces at play, and Cleveland being an incredibly diverse and large city to be doing this kind of analysis on, we will get to a census tract example in a moment, it tends to show you that the incomes are outpacing the home values, which means either you have extreme depressionary forces on your home values, which in Cleveland we know to be true. It also can mean that your income levels can be either buttressed up by high income areas or are simply a reference to the renter base and the individuals that are not purchasing homes in the city. They have plans to purchase perhaps out of the city or remain a renter. And the inverse is true, and this is the story of gentrification that we talk about on the coastal cities, but take a look at San Francisco or Seattle, where the median house value is approximately 150%, 130% when you get to the city. So this is where city values skyrocket, demand is exceptionally high, but the incomes are not necessarily keeping up. So when you have home values that are going higher, you've got a pressure that's beyond what the economy can support in terms of incomes. And when you have the inverse, you have an extreme weakness in demand for your home prices. As I said, though, let's take a look at a census tract to get much more specific on this. So here's a census tract in Old Brooklyn, which is one of our middle neighborhoods of focus. What you see here is that taking the gross income of a family of 4 in this area and running some basic sort of analysis of what their budgeting would look like, we can come up with a maximum debt load for that household of around $1,900. And the reason we're doing this is we're trying to get a sense, while we understand there are a lot of different factors at play, we're trying to get a sense of what the current population can afford in a community. This is a little different than the housing price burden equation, because we're actually trying to figure out whether or not budgets can support purchasing in a community now, whether they need to come down or raise values in a neighborhood to achieve parity with incomes. And that'll help us get a sense of where people are migrating. And so sure enough, when you go and pursue this as a mortgage you might want to underwrite, we picked $135,000 as a loan amount. And at working it backwards, we're able to determine that that would roughly be the ceiling. So what we've done here is we've taken a hypothetical family, given it a profile of some relatively reasonable debts, and then come up with approximately what they could afford in the census tract. And in that particular census tract, using our actual transaction data, we were able to find the median sale price in that year was $78,000. So you're looking at a $50,000 difference between the loan amount that would max out the average household income in that area versus what the median sales are in that area. So we've taken that table with Cleveland, and now we are looking at just one very specific area. And so we can see that if the home values are considerably higher, this max loan amount is at about 100% the county average that year, whereas the actual sales in that area are almost 55% the regional average. So home prices are really the concern here. And it also shows what we call NOAH, the naturally occurring affordable housing concept, which basically says that these are areas where the quality of housing, because it is sufficient and relatively strong for the community at large, individuals can afford to buy in these places. And so when we have this going on and the prevalence of the investor buyers coming in, what we know is that we're seeing something that is actually impeding the quality of the neighborhood to a degree where individuals don't want to buy where they already live, right? We do know that it is easier to convince local residents to remain local than it is to attract new residents. And so a little segue here, we're going to talk about how the regional housing market got us to a place to look for these tipping point neighborhoods we call middle communities. When you look at this chart here with this price per square foot, we've got the y-axis isn't coming up here, but this goes roughly from 0 to around $230 a square foot at the top. And what it's showing us is that we do have a regional housing market with quite a considerable divergence of prices. Center for Community Progress did some research and helped us identify sort of what we call the Goldilocks region. So it's a price point where we feel as though the tipping is occurring. Stability within this range exists. And so if we see home prices in our market in this price range, we can expect as a median that the home values are stable. And so this is where we sort of consider a stable and mature middle market existing. When we bring in where the suburbs are of our region, because again, this was an analysis to figure out Cleveland's middle communities, we realize that in fact, Cleveland's housing market does not have a lot of places. It really has almost none, about 4 census tracts total that achieve this stable market quality. And so our efforts have been already on the decline. Arguably 25 years ago, 20 years ago, had we started this work, we might have had some stable markets to preserve. Now we are facing the undermining forces and we need to be even more vigilant in our work. And so once we figured out these places, we actually designed a tool that creates an index score using over 140 variables. Here's just a few of them. These indicators does a better job of helping you identify place at a very small level than simply using a variety of our typical sources. So for example, if you're looking at your city and you're looking at home values, and even if you're looking at the parcel level data, trying to figure out where home values are teetering in this area, that's just one piece of information. And of course, we know that there's a comprehensive reason why neighborhoods grow or shrink, why values ascend or descend. And that might be that an area that has a lot of demolition, it has a lot of foreclosure, might actually be a place that in its third or fourth year following that trend is actually one of the more strong communities in a city. And so we can't rely on one or two data points to tell us this information. The cluster analysis we performed was able to actually bring together considerable data. We're very fortunate in Northeast Ohio to have so much of this. And by doing so, was able to score our block groups on what we consider to be this neighborhood demand index. And this index score allows us to, first and foremost, get an understanding of these communities. But because it's county-wide, we can then compare inside and outside of the city of Cleveland and do and perform an understanding sort of analysis of what the competition is for these communities. So when you look at the county graphic here, you can get a sense that that white line, which represents Cleveland's borders, these markets straddle these borders, right? Especially the green markets, which are your middle markets, they kind of fluctuate in and out of the communities, which has more to do with migration patterns. And again, people, once they live somewhere, tend to gravitate to stay in similar communities. And so very briefly, I'll show that our middle markets, again, that Goldilocks of about 100 to 125 a square foot, these are those stable places. All but 5 of these tracts you're seeing here are outside of the city of Cleveland. And so this is what we want to achieve. And whether it's in Cleveland or it's in Cleveland Heights or it's South Euclid or it's Middleburg, we can find places that are on that edge. And we as a municipality with our partners can do a deeper research in these places on business investors as we try to push for legislation and policy action to protect these communities. Here is sort of the bread and butter of Cleveland's middle neighborhoods work, these declining places, $78 a square foot, so we are close. We're looking at a $30,000, $40,000 gap. That is something we've designed tools specifically to preserve these markets by investing through things like a construction gap subsidy to try to resurrect parts of the market that have only declined a little bit. You can see here a high incidence of owner occupancy. That is one of the things that is a critical component of stable communities, again, is a relatively strong, high owner occupant percentage. And then the last cohort being the weak middle. This is sort of the last tier before we end up falling into truly distressed communities. You can see on the southeast side where the black middle class of Cleveland resides in Lee Harvard, has moved to Bedford and Warrensville Heights. And on the northeast side, you can see where Collinwood and Euclid Green has moved to South Euclid and into Euclid proper. And so again, these migration stories show that these are communities that are gradually declining. And when you pair this with the business investor information, it becomes very clear as to why, at least on one level. To give a high level sense of what we're talking about in the middle, so to speak, these are still low income areas, home values that are about 50 to 60% that of our region. So they've taken a considerable hit. And we still have the prevalence of owner occupancy. These numbers will change. This is a very critical time. I suppose all times remain critical, but over the next 10 years, the undermining of these neighborhoods is going to continue and precipitously fall. And we've got some slides in a moment on that. Demographically speaking, very reflective of Cleveland. And it really does go to show that middle-class places, especially in 2021, are places that provide opportunity. So we do need to look deeply at them. And then from a city perspective, and I would encourage anyone doing research on middle communities in their respective places, do some of this work because it's pretty incredible how important these places are to a city's health and economy. You can see here that they're responsible for significant portions, outsized in comparison to the geography, of tax bases, huge portions of population, right? These are bedroom communities that have largely been able to withstand a lot of the flight and outward movement. And while poverty has definitely increased, you can see 21.5%, we're hitting a much higher number than just 5 or 8 years ago. Still, we are in a position to preserve these communities. We are still in a position to stabilize them. A large portion of seniors, of course, it makes sense that would stay in these communities. So what we're doing at the City of Cleveland is looking at ways to preserve these communities as a strategic focus for middle neighborhoods. If you look here, we've got programs like Construction Gap for developers, the new tool that we're going to be launching next year with CHN, that Kevin mentioned, the acquisition rehab loans. That's an exciting one for homeowners because no matter how many developers we work with, and there are not nearly enough, home buyers are really the bread and butter of stable communities. Placemaking investments always can help with driving sort of that civic pride component, and then repair and supportive programs through HUD. But when you talk about what are the undermining forces, and you look at these, they all have a similar strain connecting them all, a string that connects why property conditions and deferred maintenance connect, why when owner occupancy levels and household incomes decline in areas, there's something that's connecting all of these. And that is, as we know, very much an issue of the business buyers. So while Tim will go into greater detail, I did want to specifically touch on how these are affecting the middle communities we've identified, because if we connect these data, it really does start to show how dangerous this slide is. So you can look in the last 10 years, this is the percentage of total sales at arm's length that have been to the business. And even though as you look at these numbers, there's a bit of a plateau in the last 4 or 5 years, I want to be clear, when 20+% of your annual sales are going to business buyers, this is compounding. And there is no evidence yet that this goes away because these are investment properties. These are long-term, financial sort of products that our communities are being turned into. And so if a street of 100 homes becomes a street of 80 homes that are not owned by business buyers, and then the next year it's 66 homes that are not, we hit a tipping point almost immediately within just a couple of years. And this is ongoing and increasing. So it is very dangerous. And then perhaps, in my opinion, the most challenging thing, the most significant challenge is that not only have the numbers continued to rise, so we have here the number of business buyers in Jefferson and Lee Harvard, we have versus individuals, but we also have the dollar amount that they're paying. And if you look here in Jefferson in 2020, 40 with a median of $60,000. Now, we thought that this could be something that was mostly an echo and a hiccup from the housing crisis, foreclosure crisis. We expected, of course, business buyers to be getting in. The growth of this and the deepening of the purchase price is very alarming. At $60,000, we're looking at what 5 years ago the individual was paying on average. And those prices are also showing that they are incredibly deeply funded, which we know we are not in places like Cleveland. And here's just 2 more communities just to show that this is prevalent. These, again, stable places, unlike the near West Side and downtown neighborhoods, which obviously see a lot of investment. These are the only places in the city of Cleveland where we are seeing, I shouldn't say that, these are primarily the most in large scale areas where we see that stability that has existed. But again, if the 2020 data is reflective very similarly of 2015, and in fact growing in some of these, while prices continue to inflate, it does not show any kind of relinquishing at this moment. So very significant concern, and I'll turn to Tim, who will talk a little bit more broadly around these issues.
Just a quick clarifying point. The slides and this information is all going to be posted and will be available for folks because I know there's a lot to digest, and this is really a deep topic. And as Tim goes on, he'll and talks about the rise of the business as buyers in our market. There's a lot of data behind this that are justifications for this. So Tim, you're on.
Okay, Catherine, can you throw the slides up for everybody? Thank you. So good morning, everybody. We have well, two more minutes of morning, anyways. Yeah, as Chip mentioned earlier, I did a similar presentation maybe about a year ago, and we're going to kind of revisit some of that with a few updates for 2020 here. So we're going to largely cover business buyers in the residential property market from 2004 to 2020. We can go to the next slide. And so what I did here is this is just a little copy and paste of some digital headlines that I've been seeing lately. I'm sure everybody else has seen something similar, whether it's been in print or digital. But it's just this idea that investors are are starting to play a larger role in residential housing. So think single family, doubles, triples. You know, the house that used to be your neighbor is now owned by a corporation. We can go to the next slide. So when I see headlines like that, I always think, well, what does that mean? And for me, working for the city of Cleveland, usually what I think, well, what does that mean for Cleveland? With my work with FAPAC, it's what does it mean for Cuyahoga County or Ohio or the Midwest? Because sometimes when you read these headlines about the housing market, you read a little bit more, and what you find out is, well, it's really a trend that you're seeing, on the East Coast or the West Coast or Southwest part of the country. But VAPAC has had a working group around investor activity for over 3 years now. They're currently writing a white paper on the group's work. But what's come up through working with that group and also with my work at the city is it sure seemed like there were a lot more businesses involved in owning residential property. And I thought, well, maybe that's just the work I'm doing is presenting me with all these cases. So maybe it's not actually as high as I think it is. So if that's the case, then how can I go ahead and measure and see if this is actually happening? So we can go to the next slide then. And I thought about kind of how to build a database and what would be something that would be doable for me based on my other responsibilities at the city. And so I thought of going to sales data and being able to see who's buying property. Frank already mentioned NeoCanDo. I'll mention them again. They have sales data going back to 1976. And for this case, I thought it would be good to go back to 2004 to get some pre-foreclosure crisis numbers and then just kind of track that through to present 2020. In January or February, I'll look at 2021. So then I went ahead and limited it to residential properties, so 1 to 3 family structures. I coded the buyers. I ended up with 7 different categories. But the focus here today is going to be the difference between businesses and individuals. You can see other categories there. And the real reason for the focus on those 2 groups, individuals and businesses, is that they account for 90% of the transactions in 2020 as the buyer type. So we can go to the next slide. I think this should be our baseline slide here. So this is what we saw in 2004. And the one thing that stands out the most to me is that the east side of Cleveland was almost 16% business buyers in 2004. I think it's also important to point out that according to 2000 census data, it was also the only submarket that was majority African American. I had a couple concerns when I saw that big number on the east side of Cleveland. I thought, well, maybe it's a problem on my end with how I'm processing the data. So I went ahead and dropped the 2 and 3 family structures, and that actually didn't really make a difference with the percentage of business buyers. So even back in 2004, less than 70% of the buyers were individual buyers on the east side of Cleveland. The rest of the submarkets were all below 10%. You can see, west inner suburbs were 3%, outer suburbs were below 4%. So as a whole, the county was about 7% business buyers in 2004. We can go to the next slide, and we're going to see our 2020 numbers. And you can see that the east side of Cleveland went from 15-16% to 45-46% in 2020. So that's a growth of 30 percentage points there. Also seeing substantial growth was the west side of Cleveland and the east inner suburbs. East inner suburbs grew by 22 percentage points up to 28%. West side was 19 percentage point increase. So when you think about, you combine the east side of Cleveland and the east inner suburbs, which in this case are our 2 majority African-American submarkets at the time, over a third of all buyers are businesses. Yeah, we can go to the next slide, and what we'll do is we'll look at all the data here over time. So this will go from 2004 to 2020. So you can see from 2004 to 2008, you're kind of into the foreclosure crisis there, 2009. You see a rise in business buyers for east side of Cleveland, west side of Cleveland, and the east inner suburbs. For the west inner suburbs and the outer suburbs, they kind of remain flat through the foreclosure crisis. And then as the crisis kind of slowed down, we see business buyers exiting the market. Or maybe they're not exiting the market, maybe it's just there aren't that many foreclosure properties, bottom of the barrel properties for them to buy. So that type of investor is leaving the market. But then what we see in 2012, as the economy started to improve, is that we see this new rise in business buyers across every single submarket. So where the west inner suburbs and outer suburbs were sort of insulated from business buyers before, they see a rise from 5% up above 10%. But the real rise, you see east side of Cleveland finally falls down below 20% in 2012, but then it rises up above 45% in 2020. And you see similar increases for the west side and east inner suburbs. And the last thing that I'll note on this slide is, and this is going to be new because I didn't have 2020 data last time I presented, but you'll see a decrease in business buyers for all submarkets except for the east side of Cleveland, which continued to increase. The west side of Cleveland was flat, and all the other submarkets had a real decrease. And before I presented, I went ahead and looked at the raw data for that. And the total number of sales is actually about the same between 2019 and 2020. So what we see for the decrease is there's a slight increase in individual buyers and a slight decrease in business buyers. I think we kind of heard or read a lot of articles about how hot the housing market was. And that didn't necessarily play out in terms of seeing more sales in Cuyahoga County or in any of these submarkets. They were all about the same between 2019 and 2020. So we can go to the next slide. I think I'm not going to do price data quite yet. So this is something, Jason presented this, and I think he just did the percentage, and I have the raw numbers in here too. So to kind of explain this for everybody, there's actually an axis on the left that shows just the number of business buyers, and then there's the axis on the right that's the percentage. So the darker colors are going to be the raw numbers, the total number of buyers, and then the lighter colors are the percentages. And you can, when Jason and I initially talked about this, I kind of said, well, it looks like the middle neighborhoods are kind of like protected from the highs or the lows. And that was just my like initial look at the data. But then when I took a second look this morning, I said, well, that's not necessarily true, because you can see Lee Harvard, they have that big spike up to almost 45%. Same thing with Old Brooklyn. They have that spike up to almost 30%. And those were some of the higher numbers that we saw in the west side for Old Brooklyn and east side for Lee Harvard. So we think these neighborhoods are kind of insulated from some market effects from what we see with their neighbors. And they are, but in some ways they're still vulnerable. So I think that's where Jason's work talking about, and I forget the exact way that he described it, but like weak middle markets or declining middle markets. So it's important when we think about policy later in the presentation, how these are places where we can preserve affordable housing, we can preserve home ownership opportunities. So we can go to the next slide. We're going to talk about price data here, just to kind of get an idea of where businesses are buying and where individuals are buying at. And I think the first thing that I'll just highlight is we can look at the numbers for Cuyahoga County as a whole. And what it does is it just shows the gap that there is between what businesses are buying and what individuals are buying. And I think it also shows that businesses are doing most of their buying in the city of Cleveland and in the east inner suburbs, just based on how those median values play out. And I don't think I've mentioned it yet, but businesses buying at these low values, businesses buying in general, isn't necessarily problematic. Some of these houses, a lot of these houses are probably beyond the scope of your regular individual who's going to buy their house and fix it up. Like we need investors to come in and fix these up, pull the permits, sell it to a homeowner, even operate it as a landlord. If they're going to maintain the property and treat the tenant well. So you see, even so we have 2004, which was pre-foreclosure crisis, and then you can see in 2012 where we still have fairly depressed values across the board for both businesses and individuals. We should note that in 2012, on the east side of Cleveland, businesses and individuals are both buying at about the same price. So we kind of have to wonder there, in that case, are those individual buyers, are they investors themselves? Unfortunately, the data can't tell us that, but it's something to keep in mind. So as we get to 2020 with the price data, most of the submarkets have nearly recovered to pre-foreclosure crisis levels. However, we still have this price differential on the east side of Cleveland where businesses and individuals are buying at relatively the same median price. And the last thing that I'll point out is for individual buyers on the east side of Cleveland and the east inner suburbs, those two groups have not recovered to pre-foreclosure crisis values. And those also happen to be our two majority African-American submarkets. We can move on to the next slide. I think we're going to look in a little more detail at what's happening in the city of Cleveland. So we had these pre-foreclosure crisis levels. We can see that individuals on the east side of Cleveland and west side of Cleveland are both buying at about the same price. In that $80,000 range. Businesses are lower, 40 and 30. Foreclosure crisis hits, you see this crash. East side crashes, all the way down to $10,000 and less in 2008. Same thing for business buyers on the west side. Individual, it took a little bit longer. Wasn't until 2011, 2012 that the market bottomed out for them. But then you can see that there's this recovery that starts. And for individual buyers on the west side, they're actually, the median purchase price is back above where it was in 2004. Same thing for business buyers on both the east side and the west side. But the purchase price for individuals on the east side is still very depressed, about half of what it was in 2004. So again, what opportunities are there for home ownership on the east side of Cleveland? What opportunities are there to get loans for purchase on the east side of Cleveland? And I think we can move to the next slide. And this is another one where Jason already presented. But it's just showing median purchase price for our middle neighborhood block groups that we're highlighting here. So the one thing that we see is that the west side middle neighborhoods, they tended to stay. Well, there's this difference between Old Brooklyn and Jefferson. So it's like not all middle neighborhoods are, it's not one group. And I think Jason's research really highlights that we have these different levels of middle neighborhoods. And we can see that in the difference between Jefferson and Old Brooklyn on the west side, and then the difference between Collinwood and Lee Harvard on the east side. And maybe the last thing I'll highlight on this slide is that the east side middle neighborhoods have recovered much better than the east side of Cleveland as a whole. So you can see in Collinwood and Lee Harvard, individuals are buying at $90,000 and $81,000 median purchase price. And when we look at the east side as a whole, it's still only 40%. We can go to the next slide. I think we're going to get into some quality data here so we can see where, what's the quality of the data being purchased by businesses and individuals. And so here, Western Reserve Land Conservancy conducted a citywide survey in 2015. Properties were graded A through F. And we can see in 2015 on the west side of Cleveland, 88% of properties bought by individuals were categorized as A or B. So individuals are buying at the top of the market on the west side of Cleveland. And what really stands out to me is on the east side of Cleveland, businesses and individuals are both buying the bottom of the market at about the same rate. They're 8-9%. So there's not a big difference there. So that again raises the question of, are the individuals that are buying on the east side, are they investors themselves? I think we can go to the next slide because Western Reserve Land Conservancy resurveyed most of the east side in 2018, so we can kind of see what's changed over time here. So what stands out, like what the takeaway from this slide is that both of these groups are kind of operating in the middle of the market more in 2018 than they were in 2015. So the purchases in the D and the F range have lessened, and they're buying more in the B and the C range. So maybe these are people that are buying to hold properties in their rental portfolio. They're looking for turnkey properties to rent out. So we can go to the next slide. I think we're going to look at the bottom of the market next. And so the way I approach this is I use board up data for the city of Cleveland. So a board up occurs when a property is considered open, vacant, or vandalized. It means it was open to casual entry. These properties tend to be in the worst condition. They're likely candidates to be condemned, or they're already condemned. And in most cases, they should be demolished. So what I did is I looked at transactions over time from 2010 to 2019. And then I looked to see if there was a board up 6 months before or 6 months after the purchase. So that kind of informed me that there was, the property was in poor condition near when the transaction took place. So the first thing that stood out to me when I looked at this is the percentage of business buyers that are buying boarded up property actually decreased quite a bit. It went from 10% down to below 4%. Unfortunately, though, when I looked at the raw data, they're still buying about the same number every year. It's just that they're buying a whole bunch of other property too now. So that's what caused the drop in the percentage. And actually, both businesses and individuals are both buying about the same number of these severely distressed properties every year. I think the average is about 126. And I was also curious if there was some churning here with these properties. Sometimes you'll see somebody buys a property in really bad condition and they're like, oh shoot, I got to get rid of this. And they flip it to somebody, and then that person's like, well, I didn't realize this property was in this bad condition, and they flip it. Actually what we saw is there was about 2,500 transactions that met this criteria for having a board up within 6 months. And there were 2,100 unique parcels. So there were some properties that were churned in there, but not as many as I thought we might see. So that might be a good thing. I'm not quite sure. We can move on to the next slide. So what I did is I took that board up data and I went ahead and mapped it and did a heat map here. And because I got to present with Jason today, the addition to the slide here is you'll see the middle neighborhoods have little outlines on the map here. So you can see Jefferson, Old Brooklyn, Lee Harvard, and North Shore Collinwood. And then within that, you can see the density of these severely distressed sales and I did this for 2018 and 2019. And what stands out for the middle neighborhoods is they were largely absent these types of sales that are severely distressed. The one exception is Lee Harvard, and they're seeing a lot of spillover from Union Miles and Mount Pleasant into the western portion of Lee Harvard. So when we saw those distressed or depressed sale prices in Lee Harvard, you might start to think about the distressed sales that we're seeing here and how that might impact sales prices in Lee Harvard, even if it's not those specific distressed sales happening. What do people see happening in their neighborhood? One other thing to point out is most of these distressed sales are occurring on the east side of Cleveland, which again is predominantly African American. We can go to the next slide. And so, as I mentioned before, buying distressed property isn't inherently problematic. But what needs to happen is we need to see permits being pulled to correct the code violations and get the property back to a productive use. And given the differences in quality that we saw between the west side and the east side, we might expect to see more permits pulled on the east side than the west side, but that's actually the opposite of what we're seeing. And we're seeing individuals on the west side pull permits more often than individuals or businesses on the east side. And we can go to the next slide because I went ahead and mapped these out so we can see where it's occurring. You all can see the maps there. I also have the middle neighborhoods outlined again. And the one thing I'll say is, so the map on the left is construction permits. So that'll include anything that's in our suite of construction permits. So building permits, but it'll also include mechanicals like electric, HVAC, plumbing, those sorts of things. So when you see the activity on the east side, some of those might be, you can think of those like an electrical permit to have an inspector come out, look at the panel, get the okay to turn the electric on. And when we take away those more basic level permits to look at only building permits, which tend to be more comprehensive, you can see how the activity on the east side kind of pulls away. And we're left with most of our activity on the west side. Although I will note that Lee Harvard does show up as having quite a bit of building permit activity. That was not the case for North Shore Collinwood. And I'm not quite sure why, because I'm not that familiar with the middle neighborhoods. I don't know if Jason would have any insight on that or not. But we can continue to the next slide. And so if they're not repairing property, if they're not rehabbing property, maybe they're buying property that are ready to go to serve for rental property. So what I did is I looked to see if after the purchase, a rental registration was created. And the good news is that those percentages have gone up over time. The bad news is that it's only about 20% of purchases from 2017 to 2019. So we can move to the next slide, and I think that's going to get to the conclusions. So we're going to have conclusions about the quantitative data here, and then I do have some qualitative information to present too if we have enough time. So the percentage of business buyers as businesses has increased substantially from 2004 to 2020. Businesses tend to buy at the lower end of the market, individuals at the higher end of the market. The exception here is the east side of Cleveland. East side housing prices have not recovered. Businesses and individuals are buying at about the same price. Distressed sales are occurring most often on the east side of Cleveland. Individuals and businesses are buying those properties at about the same rate. Construction permits are being issued throughout the city, but only on about 10% of sales. Businesses are registering rentals, but only about 20% of the time. So we can go to the next slide. And taking all that information together, that leads me to 3 less than ideal possible scenarios. So one is that businesses are speculating or otherwise holding property vacant without improving it through rehab. Businesses are renting out property without registering it, obscuring it from the rental inspection process and the lead registry. And businesses are renovating property without pulling permits, throwing into quality questionable work. So we can go to the next slide. And so this is something that's really come out of the VAPAC Investor Working Group. And this is research that's more qualitative in nature, and it relates to the different types of investors that we're seeing. And we can go to the next slide. And so new investor tactics are always popping up based on what housing market conditions are, and maybe based on what types of policy responses investors are seeing from municipal government. But there's really 3 types of investors that tended to come up in conversation a lot in the investor working group. The first one is a bulk property manager. They might own a few properties themselves, but probably not. They work to bring in outside investors, often out-of-state investors. So in addition to being a property manager, they're probably also a broker. We've seen these bulk property managers have contracts with owners that seem to tilt towards evicting more often. So they'll get a fee for the eviction, they'll get a fee for the new placement. Meanwhile, the owner has to kind of wait to get income from the new tenant. They may come to dominate a housing market in a particular neighborhood. If they get comfortable with the price points and the dynamics of the neighborhood, they might work to point investors to buy in that neighborhood, and then they'll kind of serve as like the property manager for most of the properties in the neighborhood. And we also notice we can kind of run into a they said when it comes to repairs. So this might be a case where the inspector issues the violation notice. The property manager says, I got the notice. Let me call the owner to get the money to do the repairs. The inspector goes back out to check. No work's been done. Calls the owner. Owner says, yeah, I gave the property manager money to fix it up. We call the property manager. The property manager says, well, they didn't give me money, or they didn't give me enough money, and it's this back and forth. That's not to say all of these bulk property manager arrangements are bad. We've just seen a few that tend to be more difficult to work with for tenants and for us in municipal government. The other one I'd like to highlight here quickly is just what we're calling an agent web. This is likely somebody that got started during the foreclosure crisis, and maybe now they've kind of exited that part of the market of investing, or maybe they only do a few sales or a few transactions a year now. They might have YouTube videos on you can get rich like I did, or maybe they have a newsletter that they send out that people subscribe to. So they and that's kind of how they attract new clients. And what they do is they just serve as a statutory agent. And what they often tell us at the city is, all I do is receive the mail. And that kind of gets them away from any responsibility to repair the property. But oftentimes the new investors that they bring in, there's something lost in translation. And so those investors that got brought in, they're like, why, I don't want to deal with this property. This is more than I thought I was getting into. So they themselves go find somebody to buy it. And what you end up happening is sometimes the worst properties end up cycling down to the least prepared investors. Think of it kind of like a pyramid scheme crossed with a bad game of telephone. And then the last investor that I'll highlight here is the mom and pop investor. They tend to have a smaller inventory. They're more willing to work with tenants and local officials. but they're also more vulnerable to market cycles. Cash and access to credit for repairs might be difficult for them. We can go to my last slide. It's policy recommendations. And I'll just say these are coming from the investor working group. None of these are considered final for the white paper that the group is working on. The group still needs to go through and vet these. So you know, none of these are finalized. Some might fall off the recommendations. New ones will be added on. I want to say there's like 24 or 25 right now. So these are just a few presented today. And I'm not even going to go through them all right now because I want to make sure we leave time for questions. But just to highlight a few of the recommendations, one is hold accountable every person or entity with the responsibility to maintain property. So obviously one, that's the owner. In a lot of cases, we'd like to be able to hold accountable a property manager or an agent in charge. Just get somebody into court so that way they can work out who's going to fix up the property, so that way the tenant has a nice place to live, or that vacant property that's causing everybody grief, causing all the neighbors grief, we can get that one fixed up. Another recommendation is to transfer existing property maintenance violations to new owners. I think for most suburbs, this works through a point of sale inspection. The city of Cleveland doesn't currently do point of sale. They have a certificate of disclosure, but currently we don't do anything where the violations transfer, although there is something in the code related to the certificate of disclosure that could potentially allow us to do that. And you know, I think that's just a recommendation to review that portion of the codified ordinances, and it's either yes, we can use it, or no, we can't. And then if it's a no, it's, well, what do we need to do to make it so that we can? Another one is you know, require a local agent in charge, so that we have somebody local that we can call on the phone, even get somebody out in person to meet an inspector, so we can go through, hey, this is what's wrong, this is what needs fixed. And maybe the last thing that I'll highlight out of these right now is commit the funding for the remaining demolition need. We saw in the slides that I had about the boarded up properties, these severely distressed properties continue to be a problem. So just commit to demolishing those vacant and distressed ones that remain, because they continue to be a problem in the market. And I think with that, I'll stop so we have enough time for questions, and I'll turn it back over to the councilman.
Thanks so much, Tim, and certainly thank you, Jason. It's a lot to take in. This is like drinking from a fire hose of data that's just coming at us in an incredibly hard way, and also just as creates a high anxiety and the struggles that we're dealing with in our markets. There's a couple of questions in the chat, but can you either Jason or Tim talk a little bit about you know, when you're looking at the charts, some of the trends may also be changing a little bit because of the availability of real estate that's on the market. How do you see that impacting when we're looking at the business market as well as investor market? Because it seems in some areas that there just isn't enough inventory available just for the regular buyer as well as the business buyer.
I'll jump in and then I'll let Tim pick up the pieces. You know, that's why one of the slides that I included was to show the price creeping up on business buyer purchases. So as the supply in some of the, specifically the middle markets where the supply is definitely tight, part of the challenge is that we are still not seeing, we follow closely transactions on the individual side. So we're still not seeing a lot of bids on properties. So while home prices are coming up, they're not coming up really in a strict comparison to other first suburbs that sort of are competition reflection in outside of the city. But then the business side, if they're willing to pay more and more, and they're keeping up with the market, I guess the question, the assumption we would have made several years ago was that as inventory came down, as prices went up, there would be a natural squeezing out. that isn't necessarily occurring in a way that is going to stop this from being a problem. And the last thing I'll say is what I mentioned in my presentation. We don't get these homes back, or at least there's no evidence that this is going to be something that is going to end in a positive solution. So if out of 1,000 homes over 5 years that sell, if 20% of them go, and over the next 10 years or the next several years, it's 18%, that might be the market slowing. But those homes, as they compound over time and aggregate, cause holes in our communities. Tim, I'm not sure if you want to jump more on that.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I'll add is the businesses seem to not be discouraged by a tight market. They might be paying with cash. They might already know that they have funding secured. They can outbid an individual. They're probably comfortable waiving any inspection or contingencies or anything like that. So they're not necessarily discouraged by a tight market the way an individual might pause as they see prices rise, or balk at somebody saying, well, I got a offer with no inspection, can you match that? Well, my budget might be tight, I might not be able to do that, like, because what am I going to find if I buy a house and move in with no inspection?
And the other piece, and maybe Tim, you can answer this, is we're seeing obviously transactions changes significantly, but where are most of the business buyers? Is the sheriff sales? The sheriff sales seems to have been they're on the open market now, buying much more, and I think Jason highlighted it as well. They're competing in the market. Who are buying a lot of the sheriff sales, or how the business buyers getting our product?
Yeah, so they're still buying at sheriff sale and state forfeiture sale, but it's often on the open market, so to speak. But at the same time, I wonder how many of these, if you're holding a rental portfolio and you're a business and you either want to exit the market, or you want to move to a different market, or you want to downsize, you might just sell your whole rental portfolio off to a different business, or maybe you piecemeal it out to different businesses.
And again, either Jason or Tim, how is that the impact of not having the availability with the CDC's tapping into the BOR market? How has that impacted these transactions? Is there a relationship between when BORs have been cut off and then these new business buyers have been ramping up?
So one of the buyer types that I coded into the data was land bank. And I would have to have a little more time with the data to tell you definitively. But one thing that did stand out to me is as land bank acquisitions waned over these last few years, you saw business buyers uptick. So those properties in poor condition that were taken by the land bank, it appears that businesses moved in and took advantage of the lack of land bank acquisitions. But again, I'd have to look at the data a little more closely to be definitive on that.
Anecdotally, I'll just add, your hunch, Tim, is correct, or at least I think that's where the data is showing us the weakness of a nonprofit sector that is reliant on sort of these extra opportunities, these bites at the apple. The business buyers are well funded, like you said, they're going to keep coming in, and the value of the proposition of the cash flow of these properties for long terms are considerably higher than the value proposition of the purpose of the home at this moment to the individual buyer. And so I actually think it might be interesting for us to start trying to figure out what long-term values of these properties are to these business buyers, look for where their ceilings might be, because I don't know how many more years we can see them continuing to get involved at cash buys before we think the market will help taper that.
I have a couple of questions in the chat around how can we better control landlords in registering their rental property? I'm not sure who can jump on that one, I guess.
That might be
prob-
the new company.
I think that probably falls to me since I work for the building and housing department. So we have a couple things that we do, at least that I'm aware of, because I'm the data guy. So we kind of try and dig into the data to find landlords who aren't registered. So we work with the water department. They have a list of properties that they think are rentals. So we cross that with our rental registration database. We periodically get data from CMHA, so we can check, cross-check those two databases. And actually, I saw an email during the conference. CHN is sending us their list of properties that are getting rental assistance. We can double check there. Those are the main ways that we do it. We're testing, looking at tax mailing address to try and find rentals that way. The last thing that we do is if the owner is a business, an LLC, that's a pretty good indicator that it's a rental. It might be vacant, but that's another good indicator that it's a rental. It's owned by a business, because a business can't legally occupy a residential property.
And then another question, we buy your house for cash. Folks are being very aggressive before they make it on the MLS. What has been the impact of the we buy cash and getting in front of the market before they go on the market? If we know that.
I don't know if we know that for certain, but I think that's maybe I did a bad job explaining when I mentioned, maybe you have a portfolio of rentals. You actually don't put those on the MLS to sell them. You sell them to a different company that manages the rentals. But I think probably what Sally's mentioning there is they're going to target a property that's maybe like tax delinquent, like a senior that's tax delinquent, or property that maybe has violation notices, and they try and get to that owner and be like, hey, I can buy your house for cash. That way you don't need to worry about your back taxes. You don't need to worry about your violations. Just sell the property to me, and you'll get rid of that headache. I think that's more anecdotally now. I don't know if we could get into the data. Without having access to MLS data.
Yeah, and we do see that more anecdotal, just in terms of when we do get these buyers in the court, they thought they were immune from that, and then they were like, oh, wait a minute, I didn't know that when I bought it. Well, you took a quitclaim deed and you bought it cash, and that's what you're dealing with. Let's see. Has anyone noticed a trend of folks buying and selling properties on the same day? Essentially, they didn't negotiate a sale and then look for a buyer at a higher rate. If you guys want to talk a little bit about that pretty quickly before we wrap up.
So yeah, I do see that sometimes, and sometimes it's just like a data artifact, so to speak, where the recorder will record all the deeds on one day, but then when you actually get into the deed, you'll see that so and so signed it. The deeds are signed. Say there's 3 deeds all on the same day. You look at it and they're signed, like 7 days apart, 14 days apart, and it just happened that the recorder recorded them all on the same day, or maybe even like the attorney that was involved in getting everybody to sign. Maybe he or she held all the deeds and then went and filed them at one time. So it usually requires a little bit of digging to figure out what's going on with some of these.
Yeah, that's true. So we're hitting our at the end here. Any last comments from Jason or Tim before we close this session?
Well, I thank you all again the opportunity to continue sharing this idea of a strategic approach to our neighborhood investment. When we look at the policy proposals that Tim's sharing, that the working group is working on, our ability to perform a lot of them is hindered by the resources at the city, and this is true across all Ohio cities in some level. And so figuring out which tools can be used in an approach, even if you consider them to be pilots as ways of intervention, finding places where limiting 40 business buyers down to 20 in a given year will actually make a substantial difference to a market. It's difficult work to make those calls, but we do need to find places for these wins to actually make a huge difference. And that's where the middle neighborhood strategy comes in.
Great, thank you, Jason. And Tim?
I think the thing that I'll close with is the investor working group is continuing to work on the white paper, hoping to finish that the first quarter of next year. And the idea there is that it would be something that could be presented to Mayor-elect Bibb and his staff as they start their 4-year term, but also something that can be presented to other leaders throughout the county, whether that's at the municipal level or the county level. And then there might be room for some state level action, but we're still exploring where that would be with the balance in the state house. But thank you, everybody. Thank